A lonely millionaire, facing his final months, makes a decision that will forever change the fate of 5 desperate strangers. When Richard Wellington opens the doors of his mansion to an ex-con seeking redemption, a young woman writer haunted by trauma, a Syrian refugee engineer, single mother struggling on the streets, and a brilliant orphan teenager, he has no idea he is about to discover the true meaning of family. What starts as an act of charity turns into something much deeper, a journey of mutual healing that will prove love can work miracles, and sometimes strangers become the truest family anyone could ever have. But when Richard reveals his most devastating secret, these 5 strangers will have to decide if they are willing to honor a legacy that will change thousands of lives forever.
Hello. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like. At the end, please rate the story. I will be happy to respond to you in the comments. Now, let's get to the story.
The pendulum clock in the entrance hall of the Wellington mansion echoed its solitary melody for the 12th time that October morning. Richard Wellington adjusted his reading glasses and let the newspaper slip from his trembling fingers, falling silently onto the Persian rug that adorned the marble floor of his private library. At 68 years old, Richard felt each beat of his heart as a cruel reminder of the sentence he bore. 3 months had passed since Dr. Morrison had uttered those words that still reverberated in his mind like an unrelenting echo. 6 months, Mr. Wellington? Perhaps less if you do not respond well to treatment. Pancreatic cancer did not forgive, did not negotiate, did not offer second chances or last-minute miracles. He rose from the leather armchair where he spent most of his days, his legs protesting against the movement. The pain radiating from his abdomen was constant now, an unwanted companion that accompanied him with every breath. The 15-room mansion stretched around him like a mausoleum of memories, each room echoing with the absence of voices that once filled those halls with laughter, conversation, and the comforting sound of life being lived. The soft sound of Martha's footsteps echoed down the marble corridor, breaking the silence that had become the soundtrack of his existence. The housekeeper, a 55-year-old woman with graying hair always neatly tied in a bun, approached carrying a silver tray with Earl Grey tea and oatmeal cookies that Richard would barely touch. She knew every nuance of his mood, every sigh that indicated pain, every lost gaze that revealed the loneliness he tried to hide behind a facade of dignity. "Your morning medication, Mr. Wellington," Martha said with the gentle voice that had become his only constant companion for the past 20 years. There was a maternal concern in her brown eyes, a tenderness she rarely expressed in words, but that Richard felt in every careful gesture. Richard nodded, swallowing the bitter pills that promised to relieve his physical pain but could do nothing for the ache that pierced his soul like a cold blade. The medications made his stomach churn, but he took them without complaint, knowing that Martha would worry even more if he resisted treatment. He walked slowly to the panoramic window overlooking Sunset Boulevard, where the palm trees swayed gently under the Californian sun filtering through the silk curtains. His hands rested on the marble sill, and he felt the cold of the stone against his skin, a contrast to the warmth that the low fever constantly brought. The view before him was familiar, the constant traffic of the avenue, tourists taking pictures of the mansions, gardeners tending to the perfectly manicured lawns. But then his eyes caught a scene that made his heart race in a way he hadn't felt in a long time. Across the street, in the small park he observed daily without really seeing, a family had set up an improvised camp. A faded blue tent, some plastic bags tied with ropes, and a rusty shopping cart loaded with belongings that seemed to represent everything they owned in the world. The scene contrasted brutally with the opulence that surrounded him. Richard squinted, focusing on the scene unfolding before him. A thin man, perhaps in his 40s, held a small child in his arms while trying to soothe its cries. A woman with unkempt blonde hair folded some clothes on a park bench, her mechanical movements revealing the fatigue of someone who had given up trying to keep up appearances. There was another child, a boy who looked about 12, sitting on the ground playing with a small mutt, the only family member who seemed truly carefree. The contrast was devastating and impossible to ignore. There he was, alone in a mansion that could comfortably house 50 people, while an entire family lived in the open, exposed to the chill of October nights and the uncertainty of each new day. Richard felt something stir in his chest, a sensation he had forgotten existed: purpose. His hands trembled as he leaned more firmly on the window sill. For 3 months, since the diagnosis that had changed his life forever, he had wondered about the meaning of it all. Why accumulate so much wealth if there was no one to share it with? Why build a financial empire if there were no heirs to continue it? Why live in a palace if loneliness turned every room into a gilded prison? The child in the man's arms began to cry louder, a sound that crossed the distance and the glass of the window, touching something deep and dormant in Richard's soul. He watched the mother approach, extending her arms to calm the baby, while the older boy looked up at the cloudy sky with an expression of concern far too mature for his age. Richard closed his eyes and, for a moment, could feel Margaret's presence beside him. He could almost hear her sweet, melodic voice whispering in his ear. "Ricky, you know what you need to do." That was how she called him when she wanted him to pay attention to something truly important, when she knew he was lost in his own worries. Margaret, his sweet and generous Margaret, who always saw potential where others saw problems, who always found ways to help without expecting anything in return. She had passed away 15 years ago, a victim of breast cancer that she fought bravely for 2 years, taking with her not only her radiant presence but also the dreams of children who never came to be, of a family that was never formed. When he opened his eyes again, his vision was blurred by tears, but his mind was clearer than it had been in months. He had spent a lifetime building an empire, accumulating wealth that now seemed as empty as the rooms of his mansion, admired and respected in the business world, but completely alone in his personal life. Now, with time running out like sand in an unrelenting hourglass, he finally understood what his true purpose was. Cancer might be consuming his body, cell by cell, but his soul still had breath. There was still time to make a difference, to transform his empty mansion into a home full of life, to use his fortune in a way that truly mattered. Richard stepped away from the window and walked with firmer steps than he had taken in weeks. His decision was made, crystallized like ice, and for the first time in a long time, he felt he had a reason to wake up the next day. The weight of loneliness he carried on his shoulders began to transform into something different, determination. "Martha!" His voice echoed through the corridors of the mansion with a strength she hadn't heard in months, reverberating off the marble walls and reaching the kitchen where she was preparing lunch that he would probably not be able to finish. The housekeeper appeared almost immediately, her eyebrows furrowed with concern and surprise. She wiped her hands on her apron and watched him with curiosity, noticing something different in his posture, in his gaze. "Yes, Mr. Wellington? Are you feeling well? Do you need me to call Dr. Morrison?" Richard smiled, and it was a genuine smile, the first in a long time. The wrinkles around his eyes deepened, but this time not from pain, but from a joy he had forgotten he could still feel. "Better than I have felt in years, Martha. I need you to prepare 5 rooms. Martha blinked, confused, her head tilting slightly as it did when she was trying to process unexpected information. "5 rooms, sir? Are you expecting guests? Some relative I don't know?" "Not exactly guests," Richard replied, his eyes shining with a determination that Martha recognized from the old days, when he still fought for his business dreams, when he still believed that the world could be changed by a person willing to try. "Prepare 5 rooms, Martha. We are going to have company." Monday morning brought a different energy to the Wellington mansion. Richard had woken up before dawn, feeling more alive than he had in months, despite the constant pain radiating from his abdomen. He dressed carefully, choosing a navy blue suit that Margaret always said enhanced his eyes, and went down to the office where Martha had already prepared a strong cup of coffee and a list of local charities. Over the next 2 weeks, Richard transformed into a man on a mission. He spent hours on the phone, his voice regaining the authority it had lost during months of depression. He spoke with shelter directors, social workers, refugee program coordinators, and youth counselors. He didn't want randomly chosen names or bureaucratic processes. He wanted real stories, people who had lost everything and were at the end of their rope. "I'm looking for 5 specific people," he explained to Rebecca Martinez, director of the Los Angeles Social Assistance Center. 5 people that the system has failed, who have lost hope. "I don't want easy cases, Rebecca. I want those who really need a second chance." The first lead came from a men's shelter downtown. Marcus Thompson, 35 years old, had been released from Chino State Prison exactly 2 weeks prior. 7 years ago, in a moment of absolute desperation, he had robbed a supermarket to get money for diapers and food for his 3-year-old daughter. The judge had been relentless, and Marcus lost not only his freedom, but also his family. His ex-wife had moved to Phoenix with the child, changing her name and cutting all contact. Richard found Marcus on a gray Tuesday, sitting in the shelter's courtyard, watching the street with eyes that had seen too much. He was a tall man with broad shoulders that had already borne the weight of the world, with calloused hands that told stories of honest work interrupted by a desperate decision. His clothes were clean but clearly donated, 2 sizes larger than his current size, a result of weight loss during the years in prison. "Marcus Thompson?" Richard approached, noticing how the man instinctively stiffened, a reaction learned from years of survival. "Who's asking?" Marcus's voice was hoarse, laden with a distrust that had become second nature. "My name is Richard Wellington. I'd like to talk to you about an opportunity." Marcus let out a rough laugh, devoid of humor. "Sir, I'm an ex-con who got out 2 weeks ago. No one offers me opportunities. No one even offers me a job washing dishes." Richard sat down next to him on the concrete bench, ignoring the cold that seeped through his suit. "I'm not offering a job, Marcus. I'm offering a home." Marcus's eyes narrowed, studying the well-dressed man beside him. "And what do you want in return? Because no one gives anything for free, especially to people like me. I just want you to accept living in my house and allow yourself to discover who you really are, beyond the mistakes you've made." The second choice came through a social worker who worked with homeless youth. Sarah Chin, 22 years old, had lost her parents in a car accident on Interstate 405 exactly 1 year ago. She was an only child. Her parents were Chinese immigrants who had worked hard to build a life in America, and when they died, Sarah found out there wasn't enough insurance to cover the debts. She lost her home, her car, everything. Richard found her at the Central Library in Los Angeles, where she spent her days to escape the cold of the streets. She was sitting at a table in the back, reading a children's poetry book, as if trying to take refuge in a time when the world still made sense. She was small and delicate, with black hair cut unevenly, clearly by herself, with a blunt pair of scissors. Her clothes were clean, evidence that she used public restrooms and laundries when she could scrape together some coins, but her hands trembled constantly, a sign of chronic malnutrition and stress. "Sarah?" Richard approached carefully, noticing how she flinched at the sound of her name. "I didn't do anything wrong," she said quickly, closing the book. "I'm just reading. I'm not bothering anyone." "I know. My name is Richard Wellington. Social worker Janet Morrison told me about you." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "If she sent you here to take me back to that shelter, I won't go. They aren't safe for girls like me. I didn't come to take you anywhere, Sarah. I came to offer you a choice. A safe place where you can rest and think about what you want to do with your life." The third story came through an organization that helped homeless families. Elena Rodriguez, 31 years old, had lost her job as a housekeeper at the Beverly Hills Hotel when the company was sold and the new owners decided to cut costs by laying off older employees. A single mother of 2 children, Diego, 8, and Sophia, 5, she had struggled to keep up with the rent on her 1-bedroom apartment but eventually was evicted. Now she lived in her car with the kids, a 2008 Honda Civic that was all that remained of her previous life. Richard found her in a Walmart parking lot, where she had stopped to use the restroom with the children. The car was packed with bags of clothes, a few toys she had managed to save, and a small cooler where she kept peanut butter sandwiches and juice boxes for the kids. The windows were fogged, and small hands had drawn hearts on the glass. "Senora Rodriguez?" Richard gently tapped on the window. Elena cautiously opened the door, keeping the children behind her. "Que quiere? If you're from social services, I already said I won't let you take my kids." "I'm not from social services. I'm Richard Wellington, and I want to offer you and your children a place to stay." "Ms. Hios," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. My children don't deserve to sleep in the car. They deserve a bed, a room, a place where they can play. Diego, with dark eyes and a seriousness that shouldn't exist in a child, held his mother's hand. It's okay, Mommy. We're a family, no matter where we sleep. The fourth choice came through the foster care system. Tommy Williams, 16 years old, had aged out of the system 2 weeks before turning 18. Technically, he could still receive help for another 2 years, but the lack of available families and his own defensive attitude had resulted in his early emancipation. Tommy was a tall, skinny African-American young man, with a small scar on his forehead from an accident in one of the many homes he had lived in. Richard found him at the Young Adult Transition Center, where Tommy was sleeping in a shared room with 3 other boys. He was sitting on the porch, studying an advanced math book, preparing for the GED he hoped to take soon. Tommy Williams? Richard approached, noticing how the young man immediately closed the book and stood up, a defensive posture learned through years in the system. Who wants to know? If you're another social worker trying to put me in another temporary home, forget it. I'm 16, I'll be 18 in 2 years. I can take care of myself. You're smart, Richard observed, looking at the math book. Advanced calculus. Impressive. Intelligence doesn't pay rent, Tommy replied, but Richard noticed a glimmer of pride in his eyes. And it doesn't get anyone a family. Maybe not. But it can open doors if you have the right place to study. The fifth and final choice came through a refugee support organization. Ahmed Hassan, 28 years old, had arrived in the United States 3 months earlier, fleeing the war that had destroyed his native Syria. He had been a civil engineer in Aleppo, with a small but thriving office, until a bomb destroyed not only his building but also his confidence that he could rebuild his life in his homeland. Richard found him in a subsidized apartment that Ahmed shared with 5 other refugees, all camping on the floor of an unfurnished room. Ahmed was sitting in a corner, trying to learn English with a used Arabic-English dictionary, his delicate hands of someone used to drawing architectural plans, not doing manual labor, moving gently across the pages. Ahmed Hassan? Richard said, accompanied by a translator from the refugee organization. Ahmed looked up, and Richard saw the same distrust he had found in all the others, but also a dignity that not even despair had managed to break. The translator spoke in Arabic, and Ahmed responded in a rapid sequence of words. He says he doesn't understand why an American would help him. The translator explained. He says that in his country, when a stranger offers help, there's always a price. He wants to know what the price is. Tell him there's no price, Richard replied, looking directly into Ahmed's dark eyes. Tell him this country was built by people like him, people who lost everything and had to start over. On Friday afternoon, everyone gathered in front of the gates of the Wellington mansion. The October afternoon was cold, with gray clouds threatening rain, and the golden sunlight filtered through the palm trees lining the entrance to the property. Marcus arrived first, carrying only a green military backpack that contained everything he owned in the world. He stopped on the sidewalk, raising his eyes to the imposing facade of the mansion, and shook his head slowly. Man, is this real? Is this really happening? Sarah appeared a few minutes later, walking slowly down the sidewalk, her small backpack on her back looking almost empty. She looked at the tall windows and marble columns, whispering to herself. It looks like a castle. It looks like a place where people like me shouldn't be. Elena arrived with the kids, her Honda Civic making a strange noise before stopping. Diego and Sofia jumped out of the car and immediately began exploring the front yard, their laughter echoing among the trees for the first time in weeks. Diego stopped in front of the marble fountain, his eyes wide with wonder. Mommy, look! There are goldfish! Sophia shouted, pointing at the koi swimming lazily in the crystal-clear water. Tommy arrived walking from the bus stop, his black sports backpack slung over his shoulder. He studied the mansion's architecture with professional interest, as if he were mentally calculating the construction cost and the materials used. There was an analytical quality in his gaze that spoke of a mind that never stopped learning. Ahmed was the last to arrive, stepping out of a yellow taxi with a small suitcase and a canvas bag. He paid the driver with crumpled dollars, obviously counting each bill carefully. When he turned to look at the mansion, he murmured something in Arabic, his hands trembling slightly. Richard appeared at the front door, discreetly leaning on a cane he had started using when the pain became unbearable. He wore the same navy blue suit he had on when he met each of them, and despite the pallor that cancer had brought to his face, his eyes shone with a determination that surprised even Martha. "Welcome," he said, his voice carrying all the emotion that had built up during the 2 weeks of preparation. "Welcome to what I hope will be a new beginning for all of us." The 5 of them stared at him with a mix of emotions ranging from distrust to fear, from cautious hope to absolute despair. Marcus crossed his arms, still unable to believe this wasn't some kind of cruel prank. Sarah hid behind her backpack, as if she could become invisible. Elena held her children's hands, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Tommy studied Richard with the same intensity he had studied the architecture of the house. Ahmed remained silent, clearly lost in a world where words were insurmountable barriers. None of them knew they were about to become part of something much larger than their wildest imaginations could conceive. And Richard, observing those 5 faces marked by life, loss, and struggle, knew that his own journey, perhaps the most important of his entire life, was just beginning. The door of the Wellington mansion opened fully, revealing the entrance hall with its crystal chandelier and spiral marble staircase. It was an invitation to a new life, a second chance that none of them had dared to hope for. The first step through that door would change everything, for all of them. The first dawn at the Wellington mansion brought with it a dense atmosphere of distrust and tension. The October sun filtered through the silk curtains, creating golden patterns on the marble floor, but the beauty of the first rays of light could not dissipate the fog of anxiety that hung over the house. Richard had woken up at 5 in the morning, a mix of pain and anxiety preventing any attempt at prolonged sleep. He swallowed his medications with warm water, trying to ignore the nausea that always accompanied the cocktail of painkillers and chemotherapy. He dressed carefully, choosing a gray wool sweater that disguised his growing thinness, and went down for breakfast that Martha had prepared with optimistic hope. The formal dining table, which would normally comfortably seat 12 people, was set for 6. Martha had used the good china, the one that belonged to Richard's mother and was only used on special occasions. Plates of eggs Benedict, fresh fruit cut into artistic shapes, warm French rolls, and freshly squeezed juices awaited the new residents of the house. Richard sat at the head of the table, watching the antique clock on the wall strike 7 o'clock. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. 15. Martha appeared in the kitchen doorway, her brows furrowed with concern. "Maybe we should call them?" she suggested, her voice laden with a kindness that barely concealed her disappointment. "No," Richard replied, his hands trembling slightly as he lifted the coffee cup. "They'll come when they're ready." But they didn't come. Not that day, nor the next. Marcus had settled into the room on the second floor farthest from the main staircase, a strategic choice that revealed his survival instincts honed by years of imprisonment. He kept the door always locked, even when he was just crossing the hallway to use the bathroom. His meals consisted of granola bars and cookies he had hidden in his backpack, eaten in silence while looking out the window, mentally mapping all possible escape routes. The hallway echoed with his cautious footsteps during the early morning hours when he finally allowed himself to explore the house. He touched the marble walls with reverence, as if he could not believe it was real, that he was really there. But during the day, when the other residents were awake, Marcus transformed into a shadow, avoiding eye contact and conversation. Sarah had chosen the smallest room, which had originally been a secondary office. She dragged the bed to the farthest corner from the door and positioned a chair so she could see who was approaching. Her days were spent wrapped in a blanket she had brought from the street, reading books from Richard's personal library, but only those she could grab without being seen. She had nightmares every night, waking up with muffled screams that echoed through the hallways. Richard heard those screams from his own room, his hand tightening on his chest where the cancer pain pulsed in sync with his worry. He wanted to go to her, offer comfort, but he knew that his male presence would only worsen her panic. Elena had accepted the room closest to the phone, spending hours talking to the neighbor who was temporarily caring for Diego and Sofia. Their conversations were punctuated by sobs and desperate pleas. "How are my babies? Did they eat well? Did Diego do his homework?" she asked repeatedly, her voice laden with a guilt that cut to the heart of anyone who heard her. The neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson, was kind but clear about the limits. "Elena dear, I can take care of them for a few days, but I can't do it permanently. I have my own family to care for." Elena spent her nights walking the hallways of the mansion, her hands trembling with anxiety every time the phone rang, always fearing it would be a call saying her children had been taken by social services. She had lost everything once. The idea of losing her children was a terror that consumed her completely. Tommy had turned his room into a teenage fortress, using furniture to block the door and creating a small space where he could study undisturbed. He had found a graphing calculator in the library and spent hours solving complex math problems, as if the numbers could create a barrier between him and the uncertainties of his new situation. During the day, he wandered the mansion with a defiant attitude that barely concealed his vulnerability. He touched expensive objects with a forced familiarity, as if proving to himself that he was not intimidated by wealth. But at night, when he thought no one was watching, Richard saw him through the library window, standing in the garden, looking at the stars with an expression of deep loneliness. Ahmed had chosen the room with the best view to the east, where he could see the sunrise and maintain his morning prayers. He had discovered a small compass among his belongings and used it to determine the direction of Mecca, kneeling on the Persian rug that covered the wooden floor. During the day, he sat in the garden with his Arabic-English dictionary, murmuring English words to himself, trying to form sentences that made sense in a language that seemed as distant as the stars. His hands, delicate and accustomed to drawing architectural plans, now trembled with frustration every time he tried to communicate a basic need. Richard's attempts at reaching out were consistently rejected. He would gently knock on doors, offering conversations, garden walks, or simply company. But he was met with silence, or monosyllabic responses that clearly indicated his presence was unwelcome. "I swear I don't understand," he confessed to Martha on the fourth night, his voice laden with frustration and sadness. "I thought that by offering them a home, they would at least try." "Mr. Wellington," Martha replied, polishing a crystal glass with mechanical movements that revealed her own anxiety. "These people have lost everything. It may be hard for them to believe that someone wants to help without expecting anything in return." The pains of cancer were intensifying, especially at night. Richard would wake up with waves of agony radiating from his abdomen, cold sweat covering his body as he struggled not to scream. He increased the dosage of morphine against Dr. Morrison's orders, but still, there were moments when the pain was so intense that he could barely breathe. During one of these crises, in the early hours of Thursday, he went down to the kitchen looking for cold water and found Marcus rummaging through the refrigerator. The two men looked at each other for a tense moment, and Richard saw something resembling concern in the ex-convict's eyes. "Are you okay?" Marcus asked, his hoarse voice breaking the silence of the kitchen. "Just a headache," Richard lied, leaning against the marble counter to hide the tremor in his legs. Marcus studied him for a moment, as if he could see through the lie, but said nothing. He took an apple from the fridge and left the kitchen, leaving Richard alone with his pain and loneliness. The tension finally exploded on Friday afternoon when Tommy went down to the television room and found Marcus watching a documentary about prisons. Tommy changed the channel without asking for permission, and Marcus reacted with a speed that spoke of years of experience in potentially dangerous situations. "Hey, I was watching that!" Marcus stood up, his voice laden with an authority he had developed out of necessity. "Well, now I'm watching this," Tommy replied, turning up the volume on a music program he knew would irritate the older man. "Listen here, kid." Marcus stepped toward the teenager. "I don't know what kind of games you're used to playing, but here you're going to learn to have respect." "Respect?" Tommy let out a harsh laugh. "You're an ex-con. Why should I respect you?" The atmosphere in the room became electrically charged. Marcus clenched his fists, and Tommy took a defensive stance that revealed he had learned to fight out of necessity, not choice. Sarah, who had come down to grab a book from the library, heard the raised voices and began to hyperventilate. The memories of domestic violence she had witnessed at her aunt's house after her parents' death came flooding back like a devastating tide. She shrank into the corner of the hallway, her hands covering her ears, trying to block out the sounds that made her heart race. "Stop," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please stop." But her voice was lost in the growing hostility between Marcus and Tommy. The older man took another step toward the teenager, and Tommy grabbed the remote control as if it were a weapon. "You want to fight?" Tommy shouted, his voice breaking with emotion. "I've spent my whole life fighting. I know how to do this." It was then that Sarah went into a total panic. She began to scream, a high-pitched and desperate sound that echoed through the marble walls of the mansion like the cry of a soul in agony. Her screams brought Elena running down the stairs, Ahmed from the library, and Richard from his office. Richard appeared in the doorway of the television room, leaning heavily on his cane, his pale face contorted with physical and emotional pain. He saw Marcus and Tommy glaring at each other with hostility, Sarah huddled in the corner, trembling uncontrollably, Elena trying to calm the young girl in Spanish, and Ahmed standing at the entrance, clearly confused and scared. "Enough," Richard said, his voice soft but laden with an authority that made everyone stop. "Enough." He entered the room slowly, each step carefully calculated not to reveal how much pain was affecting his ability to walk. He sat in the leather armchair that had been Margaret's favorite spot, and for the first time since they had arrived, he let his vulnerabilities show. "Marcus, Tommy, sit down," he said, and there was something in his voice that made the two men obey automatically. Elena continued whispering kind words to Sarah, who gradually stopped screaming but continued to tremble. Ahmed remained at the entrance, his dark eyes moving between the faces of the people in the room. Richard looked at each of them, and when he spoke, his voice carried all the weight of mortality that had become his constant companion. "I don't have much time," he said, the words falling into the silence of the room like stones in a calm lake. "I know you owe me nothing, that you don't know me, that you have no reason to trust me. But can we at least try to understand each other?" The brutal honesty of his words created a moment of deep silence. For the first time since they had arrived, the 5 residents of the Wellington mansion truly heard him, not just his words, but the pain and urgency behind them. The clock on the wall continued ticking away the seconds, each tick sounding like a reminder that time, for all of them, was more precious than any of them had imagined. Richard's revelation about his mortality had created a crack in the armor of distrust that each of the 5 residents had built around themselves. In the days that followed, this crack began to expand, not through grand dramatic gestures, but through small moments of humanity that gradually built bridges over the chasms of trauma and distrust. The morning after the confrontation in the television room, Richard woke up with renewed determination, despite the constant pain pulsing in his abdomen. He had realized something crucial the night before. Each of those people had come to his door not only carrying material needs but also dreams that had been forced into abandonment by the circumstances of life. His first stop was the library, where he found Sarah curled up in a red leather armchair, reading a volume of poetry by Emily Dickinson. She flinched when she saw him approach, but did not flee as she had in previous days. "Do you like poetry?" Richard asked gently, sitting in the armchair next to her. Sarah nodded hesitantly, her fingers caressing the book's cover as if it were something precious. "My parents, they wanted me to go to college. I always wanted to study literature." "And why didn't you study?" Richard asked, already knowing the answer but aware that sometimes people needed to talk about their losses to begin processing their possibilities. "When they died." Sarah swallowed hard, her voice barely rising above a whisper. "I had to work to pay the bills. Then I lost my job, then I lost the house, then I lost everything." Richard leaned forward, his voice laden with a kindness that Sarah hadn't heard in a long time. "You know UCLA has an excellent literature program? And that there are scholarships for students in special situations?" Sarah's eyes widened, a spark of hope igniting in her gaze for the first time since she had arrived. "But I haven't even finished high school properly. I had to work so much that can be resolved," Richard replied, slowly getting up. "Let me show you something." He led her to a specific section of the library, where catalogs of universities and exam preparation guides were organized. Sarah touched the spines of the books with reverence, as if she were touching sacred relics. "You can use this library as many times as you want," Richard said. "And if you want, I can arrange for a tutor to help you prepare for the equivalency exams." As Sarah explored the books with bright eyes, Richard headed to the garden, where Ahmed was sitting under a large oak tree, focused on his Arabic-English dictionary. The younger man was clearly frustrated, his hands trembling as he tried to form sentences in English. "Ahmed," Richard said, approaching slowly. Ahmed looked up, and Richard saw a depth of intelligence there that the language barrier could not hide. Richard pointed to himself and said clearly, "Richard." Then he pointed to Ahmed and said, "Ahmed." The refugee nodded, understanding the game. For the next hour, Richard sat on the grass next to Ahmed, using simple gestures and basic words to start an improvised English lesson. Ahmed was an eager student, repeating each word carefully, his eyes lighting up when he managed to form a complete sentence. "I am engineer," Ahmed said slowly, pointing to himself. "You are engineer," Richard gently corrected. "You are very smart engineer." The joy on Ahmed's face when he understood the correction was contagious. For the first time since he had arrived, he smiled, a genuine smile that completely transformed his expression. I want work," Ahmed said, struggling with the words. "I want help build." "I know," Richard replied, placing a gentle hand on the young man's shoulder. "I will help you." His next stop was Elena's room, where she was on the phone with Mrs. Patterson, her voice heavy with anxiety and guilt. "Please, Mrs. Patterson, just a few more days. I promise I will find a place for us." Richard knocked softly on the door, and Elena quickly finished the call, her eyes red from crying. "Elena," Richard said, entering the room, "I need to talk to you about your children." Panic immediately settled on the young mother's face. "¿Qué pasó? ¿Están bien mis bebés?" "They are fine," Richard said quickly. "But you need legal help to regain official custody. Without proper documents, without a fixed address, social services may try to place them in temporary families." Elena began to cry, her hands covering her face. "I don't have money for a lawyer. I don't have money for anything." "You don't need money," Richard replied firmly. "I know Jessica Martinez, one of the best family lawyers in the city. She will help you, and I will cover all the costs." "¿Por qué?" Elena asked, her voice breaking. "¿Por qué harías esto por mí?" "Because the children need their mother," Richard replied simply. "And because you are a good mother who has had bad luck." Tommy was harder to reach. Richard found him in his room, surrounded by math books and sheets of paper covered in complex calculations. The teenager looked up when Richard entered, his expression immediately becoming defensive. "I didn't do anything," Tommy said quickly. "I'm just studying." "I can see that," Richard replied, examining the calculations. "Integral calculus. Impressive for someone who hasn't finished high school." "Math has always been easy for me," Tommy murmured, clearly uncomfortable with the compliment. "You know MIT has a program for gifted students from non-traditional backgrounds?" Richard asked casually. Tommy let out a rough laugh. "Dude, I'm a homeless orphan. MIT won't even look at me." "They will if you have the right credentials," Richard replied, pulling up a chair to sit down. "I'll set up a computer for you, with access to online courses. You can finish high school in 6 months if you want." Tommy's mask of indifference slipped for a moment, revealing a vulnerability he rarely allowed others to see. You would really do that?" "I would," Richard confirmed. "But you have to want it. You have to work for it." "I've always worked for everything," Tommy said, his voice heavy with a determination forged by years of rejection and abandonment. Marcus was the last Richard sought out, finding him in the backyard, watching the gardeners working in the flower beds. The ex-convict was studying their movements with professional interest. "Do you have experience with gardening?" Richard asked, approaching quietly. Marcus turned, surprised to have been caught off guard. "I worked in landscaping before everything went wrong. I've always been good with my hands. You know there's a landscaping company called Green Horizons? The owner, David Chin, is an old friend of mine. He believes in giving second chances." Marcus looked at him skeptically. "Did you talk to him about me? About my situation?" "No," Richard replied honestly. "But I can talk to him if you want. Or you can talk to him directly. The choice is yours." Hope battled distrust on Marcus's face. "Why would you do that? What do you gain from it?" "I gain the satisfaction of knowing that a good man has a chance to rebuild his life," Richard replied simply. In the days that followed, small changes began to happen. Sarah started leaving her room more often, always carrying a book, sometimes even joining Richard in the library to discuss passages she had read. Ahmed showed up in the garden every morning at 9, waiting for the English lesson that had become part of the daily routine. Elena spoke on the phone with less desperation after her first meeting with lawyer Jessica Martinez went better than she had dared to hope. Tommy had moved to the smaller office, where Richard had set up a computer with high-speed internet access. The sound of the teenager typing could be heard late into the night, interspersed with occasional exclamations of frustration or triumph. Marcus had started helping the gardeners, and his expertise had transformed a dying flower bed into an explosion of autumn colors. It was on a Tuesday, during what had become an informal dinner where at least 3 of the 5 residents occasionally showed up, that everything changed. Richard had come down to the dining room, wearing a blue sweater that could no longer hide his growing thinness. He sat at the head of the table, where Martha had prepared a simple but nutritious meal: chicken soup, homemade bread, and a fruit salad. Sarah had appeared first, carrying a book by Virginia Woolf that she had discovered in the library. She sat 2 chairs away from Richard, but it was the first time she had voluntarily joined him for a meal. Ahmed arrived next, smiling shyly and trying to greet Sarah in English. "Good evening, Sarah. How are you?" "I'm fine, thank you," Sarah replied, gently correcting his pronunciation. "How are you?" Tommy showed up a few minutes later, clearly starving after hours of studying. He sat down without ceremony and began to eat, but for the first time, he did not act as if he expected someone to take his food away at any moment. Elena and Marcus remained absent, but the atmosphere at the table was more relaxed than it had been since their arrival. Richard was in the middle of an explanation about the difference between have and has for Ahmed, when he felt a wave of pain so intense that his vision momentarily darkened. He gripped the table with his hands, trying to breathe through the agony radiating from his abdomen. "Richard?" Sarah said, her voice laden with concern. "Are you okay?" "I'm..." Richard began, but the words were lost as a second wave of pain hit him. The fork slipped from his hand, falling onto the plate with a sound that echoed through the room. Ahmed and Sarah stood up simultaneously, their instincts to care overcoming their usual caution. Tommy dropped his own food and rushed to Richard's side. "Dude, you look really pale," Tommy said, his voice filled with a concern he couldn't hide. Richard tried to get up, but his legs couldn't support his weight. He collapsed back into the chair, cold sweat covering his forehead, his breathing coming in short, painful gasps. "Hospital," he murmured, his voice barely audible. I need to go to the hospital." Sarah ran to call Martha, while Tommy grabbed the phone to dial 911. Ahmed knelt beside Richard, holding his hand and whispering words of comfort in Arabic, even though he knew Richard didn't understand. Marcus appeared in the room, drawn by the commotion, and immediately took control of the situation. "Did anyone call the ambulance?" "I did," Tommy replied, his voice trembling. "Where's Elena?" Marcus asked. "She went to get the kids," Sarah replied. "Mrs. Patterson said she could watch them tonight." The ambulance arrived in 15 minutes, but it felt like hours. The paramedics, efficient professionals in blue uniforms, quickly assessed Richard and prepared him for transport. He was conscious but clearly in extreme pain. "Are you family?" one of the paramedics asked. Sarah, Tommy, Ahmed, and Marcus looked at each other, a silent communication passing between them. "Yes," Sarah said firmly. "We are his family." At the hospital, while Richard was being examined, the four sat in the waiting room, a tense but united atmosphere enveloping the group. Elena arrived an hour later, having left the children with Mrs. Patterson when Martha called to explain the situation. It was Dr. Morrison who finally appeared, his grave expression confirming everyone's worst fears. "Are you Mr. Wellington's family?" he asked. "We are," Marcus replied, his voice steady. Dr. Morrison sighed deeply. "Mr. Wellington has advanced pancreatic cancer. He has been receiving treatment for several months, but the disease has progressed rapidly. Today's episode was caused by a combination of severe pain and the side effects of the medication." The silence in the waiting room was broken only by the sound of Sarah quietly sobbing. "How long?" Tommy asked, his voice raw. "It's hard to say," Dr. Morrison replied honestly. "Maybe a few months. Maybe less." Ahmed, who had understood enough of the conversation to grasp the meaning, began to cry silently. Elena took Sarah's hand, and Marcus placed a protective hand on Tommy's shoulder. "Can we see him?" Elena asked. "He's sedated now, but you can visit him. Just 2 at a time." Sarah and Ahmed went first, followed by Elena and Tommy, and finally Marcus alone. Each spent a few minutes by Richard's bedside, watching the man who had offered them a second chance when no one else would. When visiting hours officially ended, the group gathered in the waiting room. "You need to go home," the nurse said gently. "He will rest all night." "No," Sarah said, her voice stronger than anyone had heard before. "We're not leaving him alone." "We can all stay," the nurse protested, but Sarah stood firm, and the others nodded in silence. "You can take turns in the staff lounge," she eventually conceded with a tired smile. "But only 2 of you can sleep in his room." "I'll stay," Marcus said. "He needs someone strong there." "And I will too," Sarah added. "He needs someone to remind him that there is still beauty in the world." Tommy, Ahmed, and Elena settled into the waiting room benches, with blankets provided by the night staff. During the night, Martha arrived at the hospital with a bag full of clean clothes, water bottles, and a package with Richard's favorite soup. She said not a word as she entered the room, just placed her hand on his, now pale and fragile, and stayed there for long minutes. Marcus watched everything with silent respect. Sarah, by the bedside, quietly read a poem that Richard had mentioned in the library days before. At dawn, the 5 residents were together again, this time not as strangers trying to survive in the same space, but as an improvised family, forged by pain, empathy, and the hope of a man who dared to believe in them before they even believed in themselves. Richard's return from the hospital 3 days later marked the beginning of a transformation that no one had anticipated. The Wellington mansion, which had echoed with loneliness and formality for so long, began to pulse with a different energy, the energy of people who had found something they didn't know they were looking for, a family. Richard arrived home on Friday afternoon, leaning on a new cane and with strict medical instructions about medication and rest. Martha helped him settle into the armchair in the living room, where he could observe the activity in the house without having to climb the stairs constantly. "You need to rest," Martha said, adjusting a blanket over his legs. "Dr. Morrison was very clear about that." "I will rest," Richard promised, but his eyes were already searching for the 5 residents, a paternal concern he couldn't hide. It was then that Sarah appeared in the doorway of the living room, carrying a tray with tea and homemade cookies. She had woken up early that morning with an urgent need to do something useful, something that could show gratitude without needing words. "I thought you might be hungry," she said shyly, placing the tray on a side table. "I made the oatmeal cookies my mom used to make." Richard took a cookie and bit into it slowly, his eyes closing for a moment. "It's delicious, Sarah." "Thank you. I would like to cook for everyone tonight," she said, nervously wringing her hands. "If you don't mind? I know Martha always cooks, but I want to do something. I think Martha would be very grateful for the help." Richard replied, noticing how Sarah's eyes sparkled with purpose. In the days that followed, the house took on a new and organic rhythm. Sarah had taken over the kitchen during the mornings, using recipes she had memorized since childhood. The aroma of homemade bread and soups began to waft through the hallways, creating a cozy atmosphere that the mansion had never known. "My mom said that food made with love always tastes better," Sarah confessed to Martha while kneading dough for bread in the kitchen. "I never understood what she meant until now." Martha, who had initially been a bit territorially defensive about her kitchen, quickly became Sarah's most enthusiastic assistant. "You have a natural talent, dear. This lentil soup is divine." Marcus had found his own way to contribute. He woke up early every morning and made rounds through the house, checking for dripping faucets, squeaky hinges that needed oil, or small repairs that had been neglected. His practical knowledge, developed over years of work before his imprisonment, was a blessing for such a large house. "I fixed that window in your room," he told Richard one morning, his hands still dirty with grease. "It was making that noise every time the wind blew." "You don't have to do that, Marcus," Richard replied, but his voice carried genuine gratitude. "I do need to," Marcus replied firmly. "You gave me a home. I will take care of it." It was Marcus who also took on the responsibility of driving Richard to his medical appointments after he noticed that the older man was struggling to maintain his independence. He had observed Richard trying to hide his growing weakness and decided to intervene discreetly. "I need to go to the center today," Marcus said one morning, gently lying. "Do you need anything? Doctor, pharmacy, anything?" Richard looked at him with a smile that showed he understood perfectly what Marcus was doing. "I have an appointment at 2. Would you mind giving me a ride?" Ahmed's English classes had evolved from one-on-one sessions with Richard to community events. Every afternoon, after Richard finished his nap, a necessity he had finally accepted, Ahmed would show up in the living room with his notebook and dictionary, ready to practice. Tommy had become a dedicated student, but Sarah discovered that he struggled with literature and creative writing. She began sitting with him after dinner, helping him with essays and text interpretation. "I never understood poetry," Tommy admitted one night, frustrated with a Robert Frost poem he needed to analyze. "It's like it's written in code. Poetry is about feelings," Sarah patiently explained. "The poet is trying to make you feel something, not just understand something. Read this line again, but think about how it makes you feel." Tommy read the line several times, and gradually his expression changed. "Oh, he's talking about choices. About how the decisions we make change our lives." "Exactly," Sarah smiled. "You understand more than you think." The big change came when Elena finally brought her children back. Jessica Martinez, the lawyer Richard had recommended, had managed to establish legal custody on the condition that Elena had a stable and fixed address. The Wellington mansion certainly met those requirements. Diego, 8 years old, was a serious boy with dark eyes that seemed to carry responsibilities beyond his age. Sophia, 5 years old, was a burst of energy and curiosity, still young enough to accept changes as adventures. "Is this our new home?" Sophia asked, running through the mansion's marble hallways, her footsteps echoing like music. "Yes, Mija," Elena replied, tears of relief streaming down her face. "This is our new home." Richard watched from the top of the stairs as Diego explored the library with reverence, touching the spines of the books as if they were treasures. The boy took much after his mother. There was a seriousness in him that spoke of difficult experiences, but also a sharp intelligence that shone in his eyes. "Do you like books?" Richard asked, carefully descending the stairs. Diego nodded shyly. "I like stories about adventures. About people who do brave things." "I have many stories about brave people," Richard replied. "Maybe you'd like me to show you some?" Sophia, on the other hand, had discovered Tommy in the study and had decided that he was the older brother she had always wanted. She sat next to him while he studied, drawing on scraps of paper and asking constant questions. "Why do you study so much?" she asked, looking at the math equations covering the computer screen. "Because I want to be smart," Tommy replied, surprising himself with his own patience. I want to go to college. I want to go to college too, Sophia announced. I want to be a princess doctor. Tommy laughed, a genuine sound that Richard had rarely heard from him. You can be anything you want to be, Sophia. Ahmed had become the unofficial storyteller of the house. His English skills were improving rapidly with constant practice, and he had discovered that the children were an enchanted audience for his descriptions of Damascus, his family, and his journey to America. In my city, Ahmed said one night, after everyone had gathered in the living room, there was a very beautiful garden. Flowers of all colors, water dancing in the sun. Like water that dances? Sophia asked, her eyes wide. Fountain, Ahmed said, searching for the word. Water that jumps up and down, like dancing. Fountain, Richard gently corrected. A fountain. Fountain, Ahmed repeated, smiling. I want to build fountains again someday. Beautiful fountains for people to enjoy. Richard's health had improved remarkably since the house had filled with life. He still had difficult days when the pain was intense, and he could barely get out of bed, but the good days were more frequent. Dr. Morrison had commented at a recent appointment that sometimes the will to live could be a powerful medicine. You seem to be responding well to the treatment, Dr. Morrison had said. Your energy level is better, and your blood tests show some improvement. I have a family to take care of now, Richard had replied, and the truth of that statement had surprised even him. It was on a Thursday night 3 weeks after Richard's return from the hospital that something happened that none of them had experienced since moving into the mansion, a truly family dinner. Sarah had prepared a special meal, roasted chicken with herbs, golden potatoes, fresh vegetables from the garden that Marcus had revitalized, and an apple pie that perfumed the whole house. The formal dining table had been set for everyone, including the children, with the fine china and crystal glasses that had belonged to Richard's mother. Everyone was present, Richard at the head of the table, Sarah and Elena on one side helping the children, Marcus, Ahmed, and Tommy on the other side. Martha had joined them, something that had never happened before, taking the seat next to Richard. This is delicious, Sarah, Richard said, tasting the chicken. You've outdone yourself. I had a good teacher, Sarah replied, smiling at Martha. Martha taught me all the tricks. Can I tell about my day? Sophia asked, practically vibrating with energy in her chair. Of course, dear, Elena replied. But in English to practice. Sophia took a deep breath. Today I helped Marcus in the garden. We planted, flowers. Many flowers. And Marcus said I am a good helper. You are a very good helper, Marcus confirmed, and Sophia's proud smile could have lit up the entire room. Ahmed, Richard said. You mentioned it was an adventure. Ahmed laughed, his eyes shining with amusement. Oh, yes. Very big adventure. He put the fork down on the table and began to gesture animatedly. When I first come to America, I am very hungry. I see big store, supermarket, and I think this is place for food. That's the right place, Tommy said, encouraging him to continue. I go inside, and is like palace of food. So many things, so many colors. I walk and then I see. Ahmed paused, searching for the right word. How you say fruits but is orange and very big. Orange? Sarah tried. No. Bigger. Round like ball. Pumpkin! Sophia shouted. Yes. Pumpkin! Ahmed smiled. But I think is orange very big. So I try to eat like orange. I bite. He made the gesture of biting something big, and the whole table started to laugh in anticipation. Is very, very. He searched for the word, making a face. Bitter? Awful? Tommy suggested. Awful. Yes. Very awful. Ahmed laughed so hard he could barely continue. Then American lady, very nice lady, she see me and she say, honey, you don't eat pumpkin like that. Oh no. Elena laughed, covering her mouth with her hand. She take me to different place in store, and show me pumpkin bread, pumpkin soup, pumpkin pie. I learned that in America, you cook pumpkin first. Did you buy some? Diego asked, speaking for the first time during dinner. Yes. I buy pumpkin pie, and is very good. But first I eat raw pumpkin, and I am sick for 2 days. The table exploded in laughter. Sophia laughed so hard she had to hold onto her chair to avoid falling. Tommy was wiping tears of laughter from his eyes. Marcus was shaking his head in amusement, and Sarah was laughing in a way Richard had never seen, a free and genuine laugh that transformed her whole face. Ahmed, Richard said, still laughing, you should have bought the pumpkin pie first. Now I know, Ahmed replied. Now I know many things about American food. But still is very confusing. Why you put marshmallows on sweet potato? That's a good question, Martha said, laughing. I never understood that either. And why? Ahmed continued, clearly enjoying being the center of attention. Why you call it hamburger when it's not ham? It's from Hamburg, Germany, Tommy explained. It's named after the city. Ah, Ahmed said. Like Damascus roses. Is named after my city. Exactly, Richard said, feeling a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the food and everything to do with the faces around his table. As the night went on, the stories continued. Marcus told about the first time he had tried to cook for himself, and almost burned down the kitchen. Sarah shared a sweet memory of her mother trying to teach her to drive. Tommy admitted he had tried to impress a girl at the shelter by doing push-ups and ended up pulling a muscle. Diego, usually so reserved, began to tell about the time he had tried to build a treehouse with cardboard boxes, and Sophia constantly interrupted to add dramatic details that definitely hadn't happened. And then, Diego said, it started to rain. And it was a very big storm, Sophia added. With thunder and lightning and dragons. There were no dragons, Sophia, Diego said, but he was smiling. There were. Big green dragons. Okay, there were dragons, Diego agreed, making her clap with joy. Richard watched all of this with a feeling of completeness he hadn't experienced in decades. These people, who had come to his door as desperate strangers, had become something he had never dared to hope for, a true family. When dessert was served, Sarah's apple pie with vanilla ice cream, Richard raised his glass of water with slightly trembling hands. I would like to make a toast, he said, and the whole table fell silent. A few months ago, this house was just a place where I lived. Today, it is a home. You have given me the greatest gift anyone can receive. You have given me a family. He looked into the eyes of each one, Sarah, Marcus, Ahmed, Tommy, Elena, Martha, Diego, and Sophia, and felt the weight of gratitude tighten his chest. Maybe I opened the doors of this house, but it was you who opened the doors of my heart. To each of you, thank you for letting me be a part of your lives. To family, Sarah said, raising her glass. To family, they all repeated in unison. And for one eternal moment, there were no difficult pasts, no scars, no secrets. Just imperfect people, gathered around the table, sharing food, stories, and love. The months that followed were like watching a garden bloom after a long drought. Each person in the Wellington mansion began to discover potentials that had been dormant beneath layers of trauma, despair, and difficult circumstances. Richard observed these transformations with the fascination of someone who had waited a lifetime to witness everyday miracles. The first surprise came from Sarah. She had enrolled in UCLA's online literature course, starting with a single class to test her academic skills. But it was when she began writing her first essays that something extraordinary happened. Richard, she said one morning, running into the library where he was reading, her eyes shining with an excitement he had never seen before. My professor, he wants me to consider switching to creative writing. Why? Richard asked, although he already knew the answer by the way Sarah held the paper with trembling hands. He said my essay on loss and renewal was one of the best pieces he had ever read from a freshman. Sarah said, her cheeks flushing. He said I have a unique voice, that I write with an emotional honesty that is rare. Richard took the essay from her hands and read silently. The words flowed like crystal clear water, each sentence laden with a depth that came only from someone who had truly lived through pain and hope. Sarah had written about the experience of losing everything and finding a new family, but in a way that touched on universal truths about belonging and redemption. "Sarah," Richard said, his voice filled with admiration, "this is extraordinary. You not only have a talent for writing, you have something to say." "Do you really think so?" Sarah asked, still unable to fully believe the compliment. "I think you should seriously consider your professor's suggestion," Richard replied. "And I think you should start working on longer stories. Maybe short stories, or even a novel." In the days that followed, Sarah could be found writing in every corner of the house. She set up a small office in the sunroom, where natural light filtered through the tropical plants that Marcus had adopted. Her stories began to flow as if they had been waiting years to be released. "I never thought the bad things that happened to me could turn into something beautiful," she confessed to Richard one afternoon, after finishing a particularly moving short story about a woman who finds redemption through compassion. "The hardest experiences in life often become our greatest source of wisdom," Richard replied. "You are turning your pain into art, and that is one of the most courageous acts anyone can do." Marcus was the next surprise. David Chen, the owner of Green Horizons, had initially offered Marcus a simple gardening job, but soon realized he was wasting the man's talent. When the company's truck broke down during an important service, Marcus offered to take a look. "I know these engines," he said, opening the hood. "I worked with trucks before everything went wrong." 2 hours later, the truck was running better than it had in months. David Chin was impressed not only with Marcus's mechanical skills but with his methodical and careful approach to problems. "Marcus," David said, "have you ever considered working as a specialized mechanic? I have a friend who has a shop in town. He is looking for someone with your skills." Tony Reyes's shop was located in an industrial part of town, specializing in heavy-duty vehicles. Tony, a second-generation Mexican-American with hands that had seen decades of honest work, looked at Marcus with initial skepticism. "David says you're good with engines," Tony said, crossing his arms. "But I need to know if you are reliable. I can't afford to hire someone who will disappear or cause problems." Marcus looked Tony directly in the eyes. "I made mistakes in the past. Big mistakes. But I won't make them again. I just want a chance to work and prove that I am more than my worst moment." Tony studied Marcus for a long moment, then nodded. "Okay. You have a week trial. Show me what you can do." Within 3 days, Marcus had diagnosed and solved a problem that had baffled another mechanic for weeks. He discovered that a truck that supposedly needed a complete engine rebuild actually only had a problem with the fuel system. "You saved me thousands of dollars," Tony said, watching Marcus work. "Where did you learn so much about engines?" "My dad had a small shop when I was a kid," Marcus replied, his hands working confidently on the engine components. "I spent every afternoon and weekend there, learning. Then, in prison, I worked in the mechanic's shop for 8 years. You learn a lot when you have time to really understand how things work." Tony smiled. "Well, you're no longer on trial. You have the job if you want it." Ahmed faced unique challenges. He had been a respected civil engineer in Damascus, with a degree from a prestigious university and years of experience designing bridges and buildings. But in the United States, his credentials were not recognized, and he needed to go through a long and expensive process to validate his degree. "It's frustrating," Ahmed said to Richard during one of their English lessons, which had now evolved into long and complex conversations. "In Syria, I build bridges. Here, I cannot even get a job as an engineering technician without American papers. But you can work as a technician while studying for the validation exams," Richard replied. "I know some construction companies that value hands-on experience, even without the American degree." Richard had made some discreet calls, and soon Ahmed was working for Patterson Construction, a company specializing in infrastructure projects. Initially, he was hired as a surveying technician, but it quickly became obvious that his knowledge was much deeper than his title suggested. "This man knows more about structural engineering than some of our licensed engineers," Mike Patterson said to Richard during a call. "He detected a potential problem in the downtown bridge design that we had completely overlooked." "Ahmed has always been exceptional," Richard replied. "He just needs a chance to prove it." In the following months, Ahmed worked tirelessly. He woke up at 5 in the morning to study for the validation exams, worked all day at Patterson Construction, and then spent his nights reviewing math and American building codes. His determination was inspiring. "I will be an engineer again," he told Richard one night, surrounded by study books and calculators. "I will build beautiful things in America, like I built in Syria." "I have no doubt," Richard replied. "You just need time." Tommy was perhaps the most surprising transformation of all. He had completed high school online in 6 months, as Richard had predicted, but it was when he began to explore the possibilities of programming that something extraordinary happened. "Dude, it's like math, but with a purpose," Tommy said to Richard, his eyes glued to the computer screen. "You can create things that really make a difference in people's lives." Tommy had started with basic programming but quickly progressed to more complex projects. He developed a simple app to help Elena keep track of the children's medication schedules, then created a system for Marcus to organize his tools in the shop. "You have a natural talent for this," Richard said, watching Tommy work on a particularly complex project. "Have you ever considered applying for computer science programs?" "I thought about it," Tommy admitted. "But I don't know if I'm smart enough for really good colleges." "Tommy," Richard said firmly, "you are one of the smartest people I have ever met. You just never had the right opportunities to show it." With Richard's encouragement, Tommy applied to several universities, including some of the best tech schools in the country. His grades were excellent, and his programming projects were impressive for someone who had learned everything on his own. "I got a response from MIT," Tommy said one morning, holding an envelope with trembling hands. "Open it," Richard said, although he already knew from the expression on the young man's face what the answer was. I got in," Tommy said, his voice barely rising above a whisper. "They accepted me. With a full scholarship." The joy in the room was contagious. Sarah dropped her book and ran to hug Tommy. Ahmed started clapping, and Marcus came running down the stairs, drawn by the commotion. "MIT," Marcus said, shaking his head in admiration. "Dude, you're going to MIT?" Elena was the last to embark on her journey of personal growth, but when she finally did, it was with a determination that surprised everyone. She had casually mentioned that she had always dreamed of being a nurse, but had never had the opportunity to complete her studies. "I started the course in Guatemala," she confessed to Richard one night, after the children were asleep. "But when my husband died, I had to work to support Diego and Sofia. I never managed to finish it." "You know there are programs for people in your situation," Richard said. "Programs that recognize prior studies and offer flexible schedules for single parents." "But the kids," Elena began. "The kids have a whole family here to take care of them," Richard replied. "Sarah, Ahmed, Marcus, Tommy, Martha, we can all help. You deserve to pursue your dreams." Elena enrolled in the nursing program at the local community college, which offered evening and weekend classes. She was a dedicated student, absorbing information with the hunger of someone who had waited years for this opportunity. "I've always wanted to help people," she told Sarah as they studied together in the library. "When I was a child in Guatemala, I took care of my abuela when she was sick. I knew then that I wanted to be a nurse." "You're already a natural caregiver," Sarah replied. "You take care of all of us." Richard watched all these transformations with a mix of paternal pride and deep gratitude. He had started by opening his home to needy strangers, but now he realized he was the one who had received the most. It was on a particularly quiet night, after everyone had retreated to their rooms, that Richard found Martha in the kitchen preparing tea. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" he asked. "Of course, sir," Martha replied, although she no longer called him sir as often. Richard sat at the small kitchen table, a place he would never have considered occupying years before. "Martha, I want to tell you something." "What is it?" she asked, joining him with 2 cups of tea. "When Catherine died," Richard began, his voice heavy with old memories, "I thought my life was over. Not my physical life, but my real life. My ability to feel joy, to have purpose, to love." Martha nodded silently, encouraging him to continue. "I shut myself off from the world. I focused on business, on finances, on accumulating more and more money, as if that could fill the void that Catherine had left. I became rich, richer than I ever dreamed possible, but I wasn't living. I was just existing," Martha gently completed. "Exactly," Richard said, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I thought I had forever lost the ability to care about other people. I thought the part of me that loved had died with Catherine. But it hadn't died," Martha said. "No," Richard agreed, smiling through his tears. "It was just asleep, waiting for the right family to wake it up." He paused, taking a sip of tea, organizing his thoughts. "When Sarah showed up at my door that night, muddy and awake, I almost didn't let her in. I almost chose the safety of my solitude over the risk of caring again. But something in the way she looked at me—" "She needed you," Martha said. "No," Richard shook his head. "I needed her. I needed all of them. I just didn't know it yet." Richard stood up and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the garden where Marcus had planted a new section of seasonal flowers. He could see the light from the office where Tommy was probably still programming, and the soft light from the living room where Ahmed often read late into the night. "I've watched Sarah blossom from a broken woman into a talented writer who will inspire people with her words. I've seen Marcus turn his guilt into purpose, using his hands to create beauty and solve problems. Ahmed is rebuilding his career with a determination that humbles me. Tommy is going to MIT, Martha. And Elena is pursuing a dream she had given up on years ago. And you were an essential part of each of those transformations," Martha said. "But they were essential to mine," Richard replied, returning to the table. "They gave me back something I thought I had lost forever." "What was it?" Martha asked, though she already knew the answer. Richard looked at her with a smile that transformed his whole face, years of sadness and isolation fading like morning mist. "For the first time in 15 years, Martha, I am truly living." The call came on a Tuesday morning, when the house was still immersed in the comfortable routine they had established over the months. Richard was in the library, helping Diego with a history project on World War II, when the phone rang. It was Dr. Morrison, and his voice had a tone that Richard knew all too well. "Richard, I need you to come to the office today. We have the results of your most recent tests." "Can I ask?" Richard began, but stopped. He already knew from the long pause before the answer. "It's better if we talk in person," Dr. Morrison said gently. "Can you come at 2 o'clock? Richard hung up the phone with hands that trembled slightly. Diego looked at him with worried eyes, the child's premature wisdom sensing the change in the air. "Is everything okay, Mr. Richard?" Diego asked. "Everything is fine, my young friend," Richard lied softly. "Just some adult things I need to sort out." Marcus took him to the office, as had become routine. During the drive, they talked about the project for the new shelf that Marcus was building for the library, about Tommy's plans for MIT, about anything except the tension that filled the space between them. In the office, Dr. Morrison wasted no time on pleasantries. The tests showed that the cancer had spread much more rapidly than anyone had anticipated. Liver, lungs, bones, it was everywhere now, growing with an aggressiveness that defied all treatments. "How long?" Richard asked, his voice surprisingly calm. "Weeks," Dr. Morrison replied, his own voice laden with decades of experience in delivering impossible news. "Maybe 2 months, if we're lucky." "I'm so sorry, Richard. I really hoped we would have more time." "We all hoped," Richard said, and then asked the question that was burning in his chest. "Will it hurt?" "We will manage the pain," Dr. Morrison promised. "You won't suffer," We can arrange for palliative care at home, if that's what you prefer. That's what I prefer, Richard confirmed. I want to die at home, with my family. The drive back home was silent. Marcus drove with extra care, as if he could protect Richard from reality through smooth driving. He didn't ask about the results he didn't need to. The truth was written on Richard's face, in the way he looked out the window as if he were seeing the city for the last time. It was almost dinner time when they arrived home. Richard asked Martha to gather everyone in the living room after the meal. She looked at him with questioning eyes but nodded without asking questions. Dinner was torturous. Richard watched every face around the table, imprinting in his memory each expression, each laugh, each moment of family interaction. Sophia told an elaborate story about a butterfly she had seen in the garden, with impossible details that made everyone laugh. Ahmed had news about his validation tests. He was progressing faster than he expected. Sarah had received an enthusiastic response from a literary magazine about one of her short stories. They want to publish my story, she said, her eyes shining with joy. My first publication. That's wonderful, dear, Richard said, and his voice carried so much genuine pride that no one noticed the sadness lurking behind it. After dinner, everyone gathered in the living room, as Richard had requested. The children sat on the rug, Diego reading a book quietly to Sophia. The adults occupied the armchairs and the sofa, a layout that had become natural over the months. Richard stood before the fireplace, his hands trembling slightly. The fire danced behind him, creating shadows that seemed to move with the gravity of the moment. I have something important to tell you, he began, his voice weaker than anyone remembered hearing. The room fell into absolute silence. Even Sophia stopped flipping through her picture book. Today I received news from my doctors, Richard continued, each word weighing like lead in the air. The cancer has spread more rapidly than we expected. I have only a few weeks to live. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah was the first to break, a sound that was half sob, half groan escaping from her throat. Elena covered her mouth with her hands, tears already streaming down her face. Marcus closed his eyes tightly, as if that could make the words disappear. No, Tommy said, his voice breaking. No, this can't be right. You were getting better. You were. I was living, Richard said softly. For the first time in 15 years, I was truly living. And that was because of you. Ahmed stood up abruptly, walking to the window, his hands trembling. This is not fair, he said, his voice laden with anger and pain. This is not right. You are a good man. You save us all. Please sit down, Richard said gently. There's more I need to say. Reluctantly, everyone settled down, though the tension in the room was palpable. The children had sensed that something was wrong. Sophia had snuggled against Elena, and Diego looked at Richard with wide, frightened eyes. First, Richard said, I want you to know that I always knew my time was limited. When you came to my door, I already knew I probably had less than a year to live. You knew? Sarah asked, her voice a whisper. I knew, Richard confirmed. And I want you to understand something very important. I didn't choose to help you out of pity. I didn't take you in because I felt sorry for your situations. I did it because I saw something extraordinary in each of you. Richard walked to where Sarah was sitting, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. Sarah, when you knocked on my door that night, I saw a writer. You may not have known it yet, but I saw it. I saw a woman who had been through more pain than anyone should have to endure, but who still had enough compassion to care for strangers. I saw someone who would turn her pain into beauty. He moved to Marcus. Marcus, I saw a man who had made mistakes, but who had the courage to try to be better. I saw hands that could build and repair, not just things, but lives. I saw integrity, even when you didn't believe you had it. Ahmed, he said, turning to the man still standing by the window. I saw an engineer who would build bridges, not just physical bridges, but bridges between cultures, between people. I saw somebody who would never give up on his dreams, no matter how hard the journey was. Tommy, Richard said, his voice filled with paternal pride. I saw a brilliant mind that just needed the right opportunity to shine. I saw someone who would use his intelligence to make the world better. And Elena, he said, turning to the woman who was silently crying. I saw a mother who would do anything for her children, but who also deserved the chance to pursue her own dreams. I saw a natural caregiver who would help heal not just bodies, but spirits. Richard returned to his position in front of the fireplace, leaning on the mantel as he gathered strength for the hardest part. I didn't tell you about my own youth, he said. When I was 22, I was lost too. My parents had died in a car accident, I had lost my job, and I was living on the street. I was hungry, cold, and hopeless. The room was in absolute silence now, everyone caught in the story Richard had never told. A family found me sleeping on a park bench one winter night. The Hendersons, James and Margaret Henderson. They could have ignored me, could have called the police, but instead, they took me home. Richard paused, lost in memories of decades past. They gave me food, clothes, and more importantly, they gave me hope. James got me a job at his construction company. Margaret taught me how to manage money, to dream of the future again. They treated me like family, gave me the stability I needed to rebuild my life. What happened to them? Sarah asked softly. They lived long and happy lives, Richard replied, smiling through tears. When James died, he left me a small amount of money and a letter. The letter said, Richard, you gave us more joy than we ever gave you. Now it's your turn to pay it forward. I used that money to start my first business. All the successes I had afterward, all the wealth I accumulated, it all started with their kindness. I always knew that one day I would have to pay it forward, but after Catherine died, I forgot. I forgot who I was, where I came from. Richard looked at each person in the room, his eyes shining with urgency. You reminded me. You gave me the chance to finally honor the memory of James and Margaret. You allowed me to complete the circle. But what now? Tommy asked, his voice breaking. What do we do now? Now, Richard said, his voice growing stronger. You do what I did. You live. You thrive. You use the gifts you discovered to make the world better. And when you find yourselves in a position to help others, you pay it forward. Richard walked to the center of the room, where everyone could see him clearly. I want you to make me a promise, he said. I want you to promise that you will stay united, that you will support each other, that you will use everything you learn here to help individually. Looking into my eyes. Sarah was the first. She stood up on trembling legs and walked over to Richard. I promise, she said, her voice steady despite the tears. I promise I will use my writing to help others. I promise I will keep this family together. Marcus was next. He placed his large hands on Richard's shoulders. I promise I will be the man you helped me become. I promise I will look for people who need help, and I will reach out, just like you did for me. Ahmed stepped forward, fighting back tears. I promise I will build beautiful things in America. I promise I will help other refugees, other people who are lost and afraid. I promise I will remember your kindness every day. Tommy could barely speak. I promise I will use my education to make a difference. I promise I will remember that intelligence without compassion is worth nothing. I promise I will take care of this family. Elena was the last. She had stopped crying, and her face showed the determination that had carried her through so many hardships. I promise I will become the best nurse I can be. I promise I will teach my children about kindness, about helping others. I promise that this family you gave us will last forever. Richard nodded, a smile of deep peace crossing his face. Then I can die in peace, he said. Knowing that the chain of good will continue. Knowing that the Hendersons' kindness will live on through you, and through the people you will help. He paused, looking at each face one last time. Now come here. All of you. Let me hug my family while I still can. And there, in the living room that had become the heart of an unlikely home, 8 people embraced as if they could hold time in their hands, as if love could conquer even death. Richard's last days were a mix of serenity and urgency. He had chosen to stay at home, surrounded by the family he had created, refusing to spend his final moments in a cold, impersonal hospital environment. Dr. Morrison came twice a day, adjusting medications to control the pain, but it was clear that time was running out quickly. The house had transformed into a kind of sanctuary. Sarah had temporarily paused her classes to spend more time with Richard. Marcus had negotiated with Tony to work only part-time. Ahmed had taken a leave from Patterson Construction. Elena had rearranged her study schedule. Tommy had postponed his departure for MIT by a few weeks. Everyone wanted to be present for every precious moment that remained. It was on a Thursday morning, when Richard was sitting in his favorite armchair in the library, that he asked Martha to call everyone for an important meeting. His voice was weaker now, but his eyes still shone with the determination that had characterized him throughout his life. "There is something I need to share with you," he said as everyone gathered around him. "Something I have been waiting to discuss in these last days." He gestured to Martha, who brought a brown leather folder that Richard kept in his private office. "In the past few weeks, I have completely altered my will," Richard said, his voice carrying a tone that mixed seriousness with deep satisfaction. "I wanted you to know the details before it is too late for us to discuss." Sarah knelt beside Richard's armchair, taking his hand. "Richard, you don't need to worry about these things now. We will be fine." "No, dear," Richard said, gently squeezing her hand. "I need to. This is important to me. Perhaps the most important thing I have ever done." He opened the folder with fingers that trembled slightly but with determined movements. "My total fortune, after taxes and expenses, is approximately $40 million, he said, pausing to let the magnitude of the number sink in. "Half of that $20 million will be divided equally among you 5. Sarah, Marcus, Ahmed, Elena, and Tommy. $4 million for each of you." The room fell into absolute silence. It was the kind of silence that happens when reality becomes so surreal that the mind needs time to process. "Richard," Marcus finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. That is a lot of money." "Yes, it is," Richard agreed. "But there is a condition. A very important condition." He leaned forward, his eyes meeting each person's in the room. "You must use this money to create an institution. An organization that helps people in situations similar to those you experienced when you came to my door. Homeless people, ex-convicts trying to reintegrate, refugees, single mothers, young people who aged out of the care system. People who need more than just money, they need hope, opportunities, a family." How would that work?" Tommy asked, his mind already starting to work on the practical details. "I have left some basic guidelines," Richard replied. "But the specific details should come from you. You know what works because you have lived it. You know what really makes a difference." Ahmed stood up, walking to the window that overlooked the garden Marcus had transformed. This is too much responsibility," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "What if we fail? What if we make mistakes?" "You will make mistakes," Richard said simply. "I made many mistakes with you. But you will also save lives. You will give hope to people who thought there was no hope left." "And the other half?" Elena asked. "The other half, the other $20 million, will be used to keep the institution running," Richard explained. "If invested properly, it should generate enough income to cover operational expenses for decades." Sarah was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face. "Richard, I don't know what to say. This is incredible." "There is more," Richard said, and Martha appeared at the door with a small box. "In the last days, I recorded personal videos for each of you," he explained. "Things I want you to know about how each of you changed my life. Things that might be hard to say face to face." Martha placed the box on the coffee table, revealing 5 DVDs, each with a name written in Richard's careful handwriting. "You should watch these after I am gone," Richard said. "But I can share a little now, if you allow me." Everyone nodded, unable to speak. Richard looked at Sarah first. "Sarah, your stories reminded me of the importance of dreams. I had forgotten that it is possible to turn pain into beauty, trauma into art. You showed me that the hardest experiences in life can become our greatest source of wisdom and compassion. He turned to Marcus. Marcus, your unwavering loyalty reminded me of what true friendship is. You showed me that a person's character is not defined by their worst moments, but by their choice to become better. You taught me that redemption is always possible. Ahmed, Richard said, his voice carrying deep respect. Your courage in the face of uncertainty inspired me to be brave in the face of death. You lost everything, your country, your career, your language, but you never lost your dignity or your hope. You showed me what it means to be truly resilient. He looked at Elena, who was holding Sophia in her lap. Elena, your maternal love reminded me of the love I lost when Catherine died. You showed me that it is possible to love again, even after a devastating loss. You taught me that the heart has an infinite capacity to create families, even when they are not traditional. Finally, he looked at Tommy. Tommy, your youthful energy brought life back to this house. You showed me that intelligence without kindness is empty, but that kindness with intelligence can change the world. You reminded me of what it is like to have hope for the future. Richard paused, breathing with some difficulty, but his eyes shone with deep satisfaction. When you came to my door, I thought I was doing an act of charity, he said. I thought I was saving you. But the truth is, you saved me first. How? Sarah asked softly. You saved me from loneliness. You saved me from bitterness. You saved me from a life without purpose, Richard replied. You gave me the chance to discover that love does not die with loss, it just waits for the opportunity to bloom again. Marcus stood up and walked to Richard's armchair, kneeling beside Sarah. Richard, I could never have dreamed of a life like this. You didn't just give us a home, you gave us a future. No, Richard said, shaking his head. You already had the future within you. You just needed someone to believe in it. And now, you will do the same for others. Ahmed joined the others around the armchair. I promise you, Richard, we will make this foundation everything you dreamed it could be. We will help so many people. I know you will, Richard said, his voice growing weaker. You will help people who don't even know they need help yet. You will create families where there were no families. You will give hope where there was no hope. Elena placed Sophia on the floor and joined the group. What should we call it? The foundation? Richard smiled, the first truly radiant smile anyone had seen on his face in weeks. Henderson Foundation, he said. In honor of James and Margaret Henderson, who started this chain of kindness so many years ago. Thus, the circle is complete. Tommy was the last to join the group gathered around Richard. We will make you proud, he promised. You have already made me prouder than you can imagine, Richard replied. You gave me the chance to use my wealth for something that truly matters. You gave me the chance to die knowing I made a difference. Everyone's tears were now mingling, but they were not just tears of sadness. They were tears of gratitude, of love, of recognition that they had been part of something extraordinary. Now, Richard said, his voice barely above a whisper, I want you to know that every day I spent with you was a gift. Every laugh, every conversation, every moment of joy or difficulty, all of it was precious. He closed his eyes for a moment, gathering his final strength. You turned my last months into the best of my life. You taught me that a family is not defined by blood, but by love. You showed me that dying surrounded by people you love is the greatest gift anyone can receive. Richard opened his eyes one last time, looking at each face around him. I thought I was saving you, he repeated softly. But in truth, you saved me first. You saved me from dying alone. You saved me from dying without purpose. You saved me from dying without having loved again. And in that moment, in the library that had become the heart of his home, Richard Wellington knew he had lived a life worth living. He had found his family, passed on the kindness he had received, and created a legacy that would continue long beyond his death. The chain of goodness would continue. The Hendersons, wherever they were, would be proud. Richard's last days were like a golden autumn, each moment precious, each breath measured, each word laden with meaning. He had chosen not to fight against the inevitable any longer, but to embrace the time that remained with the same generosity that had marked his life. The house on Maple Street had transformed into a kind of sanctuary. Dr. Morrison came twice a day, adjusting medications and offering words of comfort. A palliative care nurse, Mrs. Catherine Johnson, whose name made Richard smile ironically, came in the afternoons to help with the more technical aspects of care. Sarah had moved her desk into Richard's room, where she spent hours writing while he slept. Her words flowed like never before, inspired by the urgency to capture every moment, every lesson, every fragment of wisdom that Richard shared. Marcus had set up a small workshop in the basement, where he worked on a special project, a handmade oak table that would be the centerpiece of the future Henderson Foundation. He regularly came upstairs to show Richard the progress, who offered suggestions with eyes shining with pride. Ahmed had organized a shift system with everyone else, ensuring that Richard was never alone. He spent hours reading to Richard, first in English, then in Arabic, the words flowing like a melody that transcended language barriers. Elena had taken on an almost maternal role, organizing medications, coordinating medical visits, and ensuring that Richard ate the little he could still manage. Diego and Sophia had become a constant presence, their childlike laughter bringing moments of pure joy to the difficult days. Tommy had indefinitely postponed his departure for MIT, something Richard initially protested, but which secretly filled him with gratitude. The young man spent hours talking with Richard about physics, philosophy, and life, debates that stimulated the still bright mind of the older man. Martha, who had become more than an employee, she was truly part of the family, took on the role of guardian of the house, ensuring that everything ran smoothly so that everyone could focus on Richard. It was on a Monday morning, when the garden leaves were golden and the air carried the promise of winter, that Richard woke up knowing it was the day. There was a serenity in his eyes that hadn't been there the day before, a quiet acceptance that made everyone understand without words being necessary. "Call everyone," he said to Sarah, who was sitting in her usual chair by the bed. "I want everyone to be here." Within minutes, the room was filled. Sarah and Marcus on one side of the bed, Ahmed and Elena on the other. Tommy at the foot of the bed, Diego and Sophia on the floor with their books. Martha in the chair by the window, her hands busy with nervous knitting. "My family," Richard said, his voice weak but clear. "My beautiful family. We are here," Sarah said, taking his hand. "We are all here. I want you to know," Richard continued, "that these have been the best months of my life. Every day with you has been a gift that I didn't deserve, but that I received with infinite gratitude. You deserved all of this and much more," Elena said, tears silently streaming down her face. Richard smiled, that smile that had become so familiar and dear to them all. "I will miss you all so much," he said. "But I am not afraid. I know you will take care of each other. I know you will continue the family we created. I know you will do wonderful things with the gift I gave you." "We will," Marcus promised, his voice hoarse with emotion. "We will make you proud." "You have already made me proud," Richard replied. "Every day you have made me proud." The hours passed slowly. Richard slept in intervals, waking for moments of lucidity where he shared memories, offered final advice, or simply observed the faces around him with pure love. Around 3 in the afternoon, he woke from a nap and looked directly at Tommy. "MIT is still waiting for you," he said. "I am not leaving you now," Tommy replied firmly. "You are not leaving me," Richard said. "You are taking everything we learned here to the world. You are continuing our mission." At 5 in the afternoon, Dr. Morrison made his final visit. He examined Richard briefly, then stepped away with an understanding look. "He is comfortable," Dr. Morrison said to Sarah in the hallway. "There is nothing more medicine can do. Now it is time for love." As the sun began to set, Richard gathered his last strength. "I want you to know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "that I will carry each of you with me. You are etched in my heart forever. And you in ours," Sarah replied, kissing his forehead. "Take care of Martha," Richard said, looking at the woman who had been his loyal companion for so many years. "She is family too. Always has been." Marcus said. Richard closed his eyes, breathing with increasing difficulty. But on his face was a deep peace, a serenity that only comes with the certainty of a life well lived. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice almost inaudible. "Thank you for saving me. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for being my family." And then, surrounded by 8 people who loved him unconditionally, Richard Wellington gently slipped into his final sleep. There was no struggle, no pain. Just a deep peace, like someone who has finally come home after a long journey. Richard's funeral, held at the Riverside Presbyterian Church 3 days later, was unlike any ceremony the town had ever seen. What had begun as an intimate service transformed into a celebration of life that drew hundreds of people. The story had spread through local media after a reporter from the Riverside Herald learned about Richard's unusual will. Soon, journalists from across the state were covering the story of the millionaire who had chosen to spend his last days saving strangers. The church was packed. Sarah's customers from the diner where she worked, Marcus's co-workers, families that Ahmed had helped through his construction company, other students that Tommy had tutored, patients that Elena had cared for during her internships all came to pay their last respects to the man who had touched their lives indirectly through the people he had saved. Pastor David Miller, who had known Richard for years but had never seen his true nature until the last months, led the ceremony with words that captured the essence of the man they were honoring. "Richard Wellington was a man who discovered that true wealth is not in what we accumulate, but in what we give," he said. "He showed us that a family is not defined by blood, but by love. He taught us that it is never too late to start anew." But it was the words of Richard's chosen family that truly captured who he was. Sarah was the first to speak, her voice clear and strong despite the tears. "Richard found me when I was broken," she said. "Not just financially, but spiritually. He gave me more than a place to live, he gave me back my voice. He taught me that our scars do not define us, but our courage to continue does. He showed me that it is possible to turn pain into beauty, trauma into art. Through his kindness, I rediscovered my purpose." Marcus followed, his large hands trembling slightly as he held the microphone. "I came out of prison expecting judgment and rejection," he said. "Instead, Richard gave me confidence and opportunity. He showed me that my past did not determine my future. He taught me that redemption is always possible when you have someone who believes in you. He gave me back my dignity." Ahmed approached the pulpit, his voice heavy with emotion but clear. "I came to America with nothing but hope," he said. "Richard gave me more than a home, he gave me a place to belong. He showed me that being different is not a weakness, but a strength. He taught me that America is not just a country, but an idea, the idea that anyone can build a better life if they have courage and someone believes in them." Elena took the microphone with trembling hands, but her voice was firm. "Richard gave me the chance to be more than just a survivor," she said. "He showed me that I could be a woman with dreams, not just a mother struggling to survive. He taught me that I deserve love and opportunities. He gave me hope that my children can have a better future than I ever dreamed." Tommy was last, his youth contrasting with the wisdom in his words. "Richard saved me from myself," he said. "He showed me that intelligence without compassion is empty, but that when you combine the two, you can change the world. He taught me that true success is not what you achieve, but the lives you touch. He gave me a family when I thought I would never have one." After the service, as people gathered at the Riverside Cemetery for the burial, something extraordinary happened. People began to share their own stories how Richard had touched their lives indirectly through the people he had helped. The story spread through social media, and soon national journalists were covering the story of the good millionaire. A week after the funeral, the 5 gathered in Richard's lawyer's office. William Henderson III, the grandson of James Henderson who had helped Richard decades earlier. The coincidence did not go unnoticed by anyone. "Your grandfather would be very proud," Sarah said to the lawyer. "He would," William agreed. "Richard told me about James many times. He always said he wanted to complete the circle." The documents were ready, meticulously prepared by Richard and William in the weeks before his death. The Henderson Foundation would be officially established, with the 5 as founding directors. "There's a change we would like to make," Sarah said when they reached the section for the foundation's name. "Of course," William replied. "What would it be?" "Richard Wellington Foundation Second Chances," Marcus said. "He deserves to have his name on it, too." "He would be honored," William said, making the change in the documents. One by one, they signed the papers that would officially establish the foundation. Sarah signed with tears in her eyes, thinking about how Richard had changed her life. Marcus signed with steady hands, determined to honor the memory of the man who had believed in him. Ahmed signed with pride, knowing he was helping to create something that would assist other immigrants like him. Elena signed with hope, thinking of all the families that would be helped. Tommy signed with determination, knowing he was taking on a responsibility that he would carry for the rest of his life. "It's done," William said when the last signature was collected. "The Richard Wellington Foundation Second Chances is now officially established." They left the office united, still in mourning but also filled with purpose. The journey ahead would be difficult, but they were not alone. They had each other, they had the lessons Richard had taught them, and they had a legacy to honor. Outside the building, they stood in silence for a moment, looking at the blue October sky. "He is proud of us," Sarah finally said. "He is," Elena agreed. "And he always will be." "Then let's get started," Tommy said. "Let's make this foundation everything he dreamed it could be. Let's save people," Marcus added. "Like he saved us. Let's give second chances," Ahmed concluded. "Because everyone deserves a second chance." And so, united by loss but strengthened by love, the 5 began the next phase of their lives, a phase dedicated to honoring the memory of Richard Wellington by continuing his mission to spread kindness throughout the world. The chain of good would continue, stronger than ever. 2 years had passed since Richard Wellington's funeral, and the transformation that had occurred in each of the 5 lives was so extraordinary that it sometimes felt surreal. Sarah was sitting at her desk in the Foundation's office, finishing her 3rd book. Her first, Second Chances, How a Stranger Saved Me, had become a national bestseller, touching millions of readers with its honest narrative about trauma, hope, and redemption. The second, Letters to Richard, a collection of stories from people helped by the Foundation, had been adapted into a film set to premiere next year. Now, at 37, Sarah had become one of the most respected voices in memoir and overcoming adversity. She was running the Richard Wellington Foundation's education program Second Chances, which had already provided scholarships for over 300 people, in addition to adult literacy programs that had reached thousands. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. "Sarah? It's Marcus. Can you come to the workshop? We have a surprise for you." Sarah smiled, closing her laptop. Marcus's workshop had become one of the Foundation's most successful programs. She walked through the halls of the mansion, which had been completely transformed. Where luxurious rooms once existed, there were now classrooms, counseling offices, a community library, and dormitories for people in transition. The garden that Marcus had started had expanded to include a community garden that provided fresh food for hundreds of families. Marcus's workshop occupied what had once been a 3-car garage. When Sarah arrived, she found Marcus supervising 5 men working on different woodworking projects. "Look who's here," Marcus announced, and all the men turned to greet Sarah. She recognized each of them former inmates who had gone through the reintegration program that Marcus coordinated. In the past 2 years, his workshop had employed over 50 ex-offenders, with a recidivism rate of less than 5%, a number that had caught the attention of national authorities. "What's the surprise?" Sarah asked. Marcus gestured for her to come closer to a table covered with a cloth. "We finished the special project," he said, pulling the cloth to reveal a beautifully carved oak plaque with the words, "Richard Wellington Foundation Second Chances, where strangers become family, and family changes the world." "It's perfect," Sarah said, running her fingers over the carefully carved letters. "Richard would be proud." "He would be proud of everything we've accomplished," Marcus replied, now 45, with gray hair at his temples and calloused hands from honest work. "Especially of what Ahmed has achieved." Ahmed had exceeded all expectations. After a long and frustrating process, he had finally managed to validate his engineering degree. Now he was running the Foundation's Immigrant Support Program, which had become a national model. Sarah found Ahmed in his office, speaking on the phone in Arabic with someone who was clearly distressed. She waited until he finished the call. "Another family?" she asked. "A Syrian family that just arrived in Phoenix," Ahmed replied. "The father is a doctor, but he can't practice here yet. The mother speaks only Arabic. 3 small children. They don't know where to start." Ahmed, now 42, had developed a support network that extended across the country. His program had helped over 500 immigrant families in the past 2 years, providing not only financial resources but also cultural guidance, English classes, legal assistance, and job connections. "Are you flying there?" Sarah asked. "Tomorrow," Ahmed confirmed. "But first, we have to go see Elena. She wants to show us something at the health center." The community health center had been one of the most ambitious additions to the mansion. Elena had graduated nursing with the highest grades in her class and, at 34, had become one of the most respected nurses in the entire region. They found Elena in what had once been Richard's ballroom, now transformed into a full medical clinic. She was examining a small child while the mother watched anxiously. "Everything is going to be fine," Elena said in her now fluent English, still tinged with her Latin accent. "It's just a cold. Keep him warm, give him lots of fluids, and come back if his fever gets worse." The mother thanked her profusely in Spanish, and Elena responded in the same language, offering detailed instructions on home care. When the family left, Elena turned to Sarah and Ahmed with a radiant smile. "Do you know what just happened?" she asked. "What?" Sarah asked. "That was our 2,000th patient," Elena announced. 2,000 people who have received free medical care here in the past 2 years. The community health program that Elena directed had become a true lifeline for the local community. In addition to basic medical care, they offered mental health programs, substance abuse support, and preventive health education. "Where are Diego and Sofia?" Ahmed asked. "In the computer lab with Tommy," Elena replied. "He's teaching the kids to code." Tommy, now 18, had become a force of nature in terms of technological innovation. He had deferred MIT for 2 years to help establish the foundation, but his contributions had been revolutionary. They found Tommy in a room that had once been Richard's private office, now transformed into a state-of-the-art technology lab. He was surrounded by a dozen children, all intently focused on computer screens. "Okay, everyone," Tommy was saying, "you saw how the code we wrote connects people who need help with people who can help. This is what we call social technology." Tommy had created a series of apps that had revolutionized social work. His main app, Second Chances, connected people in need with local resources, volunteers, and job opportunities. The app had been downloaded over 1 million times and was being used by charities across the country. "Tommy," Sarah called, "I need you for a meeting." Tommy dismissed the children and joined the adults. "What's it about?" he asked. "Martha has a surprise," Sarah said. They found Martha in the library, which had become the administrative heart of the foundation. At 72, she had refused to retire, insisting that Richard would never approve of her leaving. "Sit down," Martha said, gesturing to the chairs around the oak table that Marcus had made. "I received a very special call today." She paused dramatically, her eyes shining with excitement. "You have been selected to receive the National Humanitarian Service Medal," she announced. "The President wants to honor you at a ceremony at the White House next month." The silence that followed was total. The National Humanitarian Service Medal was one of the highest civilian honors in the country, awarded only to individuals or organizations that had made extraordinary contributions to the welfare of humanity. "Is this real?" Tommy finally asked. "Very real," Martha confirmed. "You have transformed this foundation into something that is changing lives not just here, but nationally. You have already directly helped over 2,000 people, and thousands more through the programs you created." "Richard would," Sarah began, but couldn't finish the sentence. "He would be proud," Marcus completed. "He would be so proud." The ceremony at the White House 3 weeks later was an event none of them would ever forget. The president, in his speech, called them 5 extraordinary people who proved that love can create miracles and that kindness can change the world. But for the 5, the most meaningful moment was not receiving the medal, but being there together, knowing they had honored Richard's memory in a way he could never have imagined. 2 weeks after the ceremony, on a sunny Saturday morning, the 5 gathered at Riverside Cemetery. It was a ritual they maintained, visiting Richard's grave on the anniversary of his death. Sarah brought an envelope that Martha had found in Richard's safe the previous week. It was marked, to be opened after 2 years. "Are you ready?" Sarah asked. They all nodded. Sarah carefully opened the envelope, revealing a letter written in Richard's familiar handwriting. "My dear family," she began to read aloud, "if you are reading this, it means you made it. You proved that love can create miracles. You proved that a family created by the heart can be stronger than any family created by blood." Her voice trembled slightly, but she continued, "I know you have transformed the foundation into something far beyond what I ever dreamed. I know you have saved thousands of lives, just as you saved mine. I know you have become exactly who I always knew you could be." Sarah paused, wiping away the tears that had begun to flow. "You gave me the best months of my life. You showed me that it is never too late to start over, never too late to love again, never too late to make a difference. You taught me that true wealth is not in what we accumulate, but in the lives we touch." The letter continued, "Now I have one last request. I want you to spread this light throughout the world. I want you to inspire others to create their own families, their own second chances. I want you to prove that kindness is contagious, that love can multiply infinitely when shared. You were my second chance, my chosen family, my greatest gift. Now be that for others. Be the proof that miracles happen every day, and that sometimes all someone needs is a person who believes in them." Sarah took a deep breath before reading the last lines. "I love you more than words can express. I will always be with you, in every life you save, in every family you create, in every second chance you give. You are my legacy, and I couldn't be prouder. With eternal love and infinite gratitude, Richard P. Wellington. P.S. Take care of Martha. She is part of the family too." The silence that followed was filled only by the sound of the wind in the trees and the distant singing of birds. Each of them was lost in their own thoughts, remembering the extraordinary journey that had brought them here. "He always knew," Tommy finally said. "He always knew we would make it. He believed in us when we didn't believe in ourselves," Marcus added. "And now we help others believe in themselves," Ahmed said. "Just like he helped us." "He lives through every person we help," Elena observed. "Through every family we create. Through every second chance we give," Sarah completed. They remained silent for a few more minutes, each offering their own silent words of gratitude and love for the man who had changed their lives forever. When they finally stood up to leave, Sarah looked at the simple headstone they had chosen for Richard. It read, "Richard P. Wellington, father, friend, savior." He believed in the power of second chances. "Let's go home," Sarah said, and everyone knew she was talking about the mansion that had become so much more than a house. It had become a symbol of hope for thousands of people. As they walked back to the car, Tommy pointed to the foundation's entrance visible in the distance. "You can see the sign from here," he said. Everyone stopped to look. The sign that Marcus and his team had made was installed at the entrance, its golden letters shining in the sunlight. "Richard Wellington Foundation Second Chances, where strangers become family, and family changes the world." "Perfect," Sarah murmured. "Absolutely perfect," Ahmed agreed. And it was perfect. Not just the sign, but everything they had built, everything they had become, everything they had created together. They had proven that love can create miracles, that kindness can multiply infinitely, and that sometimes strangers become the truest family one can have. As they drove back home, to the mansion that had become a beacon of hope, they knew Richard was right. They had made it. They had honored his memory in a way that surpassed their wildest expectations. And most importantly, they had proven that the chain of good never ends. It only grows stronger, expands, and touches more lives with each passing day. The light that Richard had ignited would continue to shine through them, through the people they helped, and through the families that would continue to be created by kindness, one second chance at a time.
If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. These other stories will also move you. Click to keep watching.